today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what makes the Anglican Communion. So we're not necessarily talking about the history of the Anglican Church in full, but specifically what are some of the events that lead up to what we have now called the Communion. And then we'll spend some time talking about the structure of that Communion and further talking about what are some of the implications of being in this shared relationship that we have. So let's start out with that question, because I think the first thing that we might want to ask is, what exactly is the Anglican Communion? So this is just taken straight off the Anglican Communion website. I'm going to read it to everybody, although I'm going to come on this side because I can't quite see it. It says, the Anglican Communion is one of the world's largest Christian communities. It has tens of millions of members in more than 165 countries around the globe. Anglicanism is one of the traditions or expressions of Christian faith. The communion is organized into a series of provinces and extra-provincial territories. The provinces are subdivided into dioceses, and the diocese into parishes. So already right there you can start to see how we are structuring what we have. So we have provinces, dioceses, parishes. So hopefully you can see that in our makeup today. There are 41 provinces and, as of March 2019, 5 extra-provincial areas. Some provinces are national, others are regional, but all are in communion or a reciprocal relationship with the See of Canterbury, which is a way of saying the Archbishop of Canterbury, the office of that Archbishop. So the See of Canterbury, and recognize the Archbishop of Canterbury as the communion's spiritual head. So last week, Dean Willis talked with us a bit about the significance of Canterbury in our church. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is seated at the Cathedral of Canterbury, of which Dean Willis was the dean for a long time. So within the structure, it went up the ladder. Dean was just a little bit lower. It's all complicated, but we'll get there. So the Canterbury holds a special place because it is the seat of the head of the Church of England, to a sense. The head of the Church of England is, of course, the monarch of England and the United Kingdom. But the spiritual head of the church is the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that is going to be the point in which we start to develop this relationship. But we need to get to a different sort of understanding before we kind of get into the mix of that. And that's going to be a lot of next week. So let's look a little bit at where our communion is. So if we think about those 41 different provinces and the 5 extra-provincial territories, so making 46 essentially provinces of the Anglican Communion, we do work in a lot of different places. So here we are up in the United States. The Church of England, right there, is its own province. We talked a little bit about Archbishop Hussam, who's the primate or archbishop of the province of, what is it, Jenny? The Episcopal Church, or no, the Jerusalem in the Middle East. Thank you. And then that's its own province of the church. We also have, if you know of Bishop Tutu in the work in South Africa, the province of South Africa, of Southern Africa, as its own province. So we're making up these 41 different provinces that create our communion as it is today. So some of what we have to start to understand then is how we get to this structure, because there are very differing models of church governance and church structure. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. Because one of the things that makes us unique as Anglicans is the way that we are structured. So one way to structure a church is what we know and use a term for as congregationalists. So the congregation is the entire structure of the church, and they have no real relationships with other churches that are doing work. So all of the decision-making within a congregation is left up to that congregation. So you see in a structure like this, which I've just pulled off of some church's website, you have the senior pastor up here. that is the head of that specific church. And so then the next person up in the line is God. So, good luck to them. I don't want to be in that position. So, but you can see then, so that from the leadership structure of this, we're breaking down into lots of different other areas of the work. So the work of the church is confined to that church. And so to what extent they are in relationship with other churches doesn't necessarily affect the way that they are able to make their own decisions as a church. Now, Baptists, you'll see a lot of congregationalist thinking. You'll see non-denominational churches, evangelical churches have a lot of this congregationalist structure. So that's just one way in which the church can be structured. Now, this is, I would say, it's loose to no denominational affiliation. And so the flip side of that is then what we have is the Catholic Church. So we have a very strong denominational identity. We have a very strong hierarchy that goes from the power that the laity have, that they divest into these different structures that we have going on here. So we have the fourfold ministry of, or the fourfold, what is the word I'm looking for? It's not coming. Order. The fourfold orders of ministry. Thank you, Noah. So we have the lay, we have deacons, we have priests, and we have bishops, all of which comprise the fourfold order of ministries. And then we have this other structure on top, which is archbishops, which have roles of governance in charge of bishops and everything kind of down below. And then at the very top of the pyramid here, we have the Pope. So the Pope has this central authority and can make, major changes and major decisions on behalf of the church that then trickle down to how that affects the parishes. So that's a very hierarchical model and a way of structuring the church. And we're not that dissimilar. So the Anglican Communion and the Episcopal Church, we've just kind of lopped that off, all right? So we're just... take that right up there. We have in our church archbishops. We have this structure here. So this should feel relatively familiar if you are, have been in the Episcopal Church for a long time. Our archbishops have different names. Sometimes they're referred to as archbishops. Sometimes they're referred to as the presiding bishop, which is a term that we use in the Episcopal Church. So in a sense, it is the highest ranking official within the church. But again, the way the Anglican Church is set up and the Episcopal Church is set up is that there is relative autonomy for each of these different provinces. So we have then a question of how we have this structure and how we have it be in relationship with all of these other provinces that we have. So each of the other provinces that we just looked at, those 46 different provinces, each have their own structure kind of set up here. So we have this shared structure, but we don't really have any sort of governance that is tying us together, which is really an interesting piece of who we are. So what makes us unique then is that there is no real central authority in the Anglican Communion. Each of those provinces are relatively autonomous. So they all have a historic relationship with the Church of England, having come down through that apostolic succession. We'll get to that in a second. But so all of the provinces are autonomous. And so the question then becomes, what do we do with that autonomy? And the answer is relationship. So what keeps us together and what makes us be able to be a conglomeration of churches is relationship, because we are lacking any sort of governance structure. So what we do have is a shared history. So like I said, we have that historic connection to the Church of England, who gets their own apostolic succession through the Western Christianity, through Catholicism. So we have that shared history that can connect us from the early apostles to us here at Christ and St. Luke's today. That's very important. We want to hold on to that. And then we have provinces around the world that also share that same apostolic succession, that same way of being involved with the early church and sharing or tying our leadership structure, our beliefs, our faith back to the work of the early apostles. That's important to us. We have the same governing structure, so not necessarily governance. We don't have a central authority that's saying how to use it, or how to use power or what to do with power, but we have a governing structure that is very similar. So we have the fourfold order of ministry, and we have structures in place that look similar in each of the provinces and how we share that. It's often called the episcopal structure because it is central around bishops and their authority within dioceses. So that's where our term Episcopal Church comes from. It's coming from episkopos, which is a Greek word that we find in the Bible that means an overseer. So this structure that we have is deeply biblical. It's connecting us to, again, that shared history, but also in the way that we as Anglicans work today, it gives us something to be able to talk about. Because we all have that same structure, we know how the church works, and so that's important to us as well. And a really big thing then that we have is a shared worship, liturgy, and prayer life. So the shared worship of the church, the liturgy of the church, comes from what we have as the Book of Common Prayer. So each of the different provinces have their own Book of Common Prayer. And unfortunately, my office is boxed up right now, but I love to collect prayer books from the different provinces. So I have a whole collection of things because the expression of that is so important. And we talked a little bit about that with Dean Willis, talking about the New Zealand prayer book, which is a very specific expression of their culture and context, still using the same structure that we have in the BCP. So these are all things that tie us together, and we're going to talk more in depth about these in the coming weeks. But I just wanted to kind of give us an overview of where we are, and then I want us to spend the rest of the time today kind of talking about how did we get there. So before I jump into that, do we have any quick questions? And I can see if we answer that now or maybe push that to a later date.
You may be going to answer this later, but in reading, I noticed the word synod comes up in terms of
Great question.
Diocese, region, all that sort of thing. Where does that?
I'm going to cover it in just a couple minutes, but that's a great question. But that leads to this idea that because we are autonomous and because we have our own ways of making decisions, some of the terminology, some of the methodology that we use, even though we have a similar governance structure, looks different in each province. So some provinces use the word synod, and what we'll talk about in just a minute is how the Episcopal Church does it, which is through something called General Convention, or we often call it Diocesan Council, which is similar. Or what is it called here? Council is here. Most places call it convention, diocesan convention.
In the aftermath of the English Civil War, the winning side mostly wanted to reform the Church of England into a Presbyterian structure, and I don't know how radical that is because I don't know what that structure is like.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're going to dive into history in just a few minutes, so let's try to answer that in a second. Any other questions quickly about Anglicanism as a whole before we jump into where we are and how we get there?
Just as a single, do you need any help with your boxes?
We're good. Thank you. Thank you.
Are we going to talk about the four instruments of communion?
Yes, but not today. Maybe not. We'll get there. We have an Anglican plant in the. All right. So let's talk about how the structure of the communion comes to be and why we even need communion. So this is a 30,000-foot view of church history, and maybe that's not even fair. It's probably like 50 to 100,000. All right, so we're going to fly through some things here, but these are things that are important to us understanding how we get to the place that we are today. So we're going to bypass lots of things here. But the early church, the first 300 years or so, the gospel starts to spread through the apostles like Peter and Paul. So again, we want to connect ourselves back to this time period. That is what the apostolic succession is all about. So connecting us to this early church governance here. 313 AD is a major year in the early life of the church because it becomes the legal religion of the Roman Empire. So you have this major pendulum swing of being a church that is relatively oppressed, being a church that is the underdog, to then being a major instrument and a major religion in one of the major forces in the world at that time. So it changes the identity of Christianity in a major way. So we just note that because that's important. 325, the Council of Nicaea meets and develops a set of common beliefs to help answer the early church debates. We know that as the Nicene Creed. There are other creeds before this time that try to settle that and give us a teaching method to talk about what we believe as Christians. But the Nicene Creed is very important. It's one that we still use today. So if you've just come from the 8 o'clock service, you said the Nicene Creed. If you're going to the 10:15 service, you will say the Nicene Creed. But this is a foundational statement about our faith. So that happens in 325. And I think that leads to the point, or to the notion that church history is often told through the lens of debate and disagreement. So it would be lovely if we could all talk about that. Oh, do you remember that time we all came together and it was just lovely? But that's not how we tell a lot of our history. Not just church history, but history in general is often told through contestation. So we're going to look at a lot of those coming up here. So the first big one that we should note, or at least in terms of how we're getting to the communion today, is what's known as the Great Schism. So it's the East and the West divide. It's where the churches that were together from the early churches finally break away to a different shared governance structure completely. So that leads to the Western Catholic tradition and to the Eastern Orthodox tradition. This is a very reductionist vision. So stick with me. But so this is where you get this first major split in Christianity, talking about these different methods and types of governance, of types of belief and theology. So 1054 is that great schism. And of course, schism often begets more schism. So the 1500s is where the Roman Catholic Church starts to face that own sort of schism within itself. So Western Christianity at this point starts to face what we call the Reformation, and it's appropriate to be talking about that today. In many churches, today is Reformation Sunday because Halloween is the day that Luther supposedly nailed the 95 Theses, his 95 Theses on the door in Wittenberg. So perfect to be talking about that today. And so we have those Protestant forces coming in, and that word Protestant literally means to protest. So rising up from within the Catholic Church to protest what is going on, which leads to an eventual breakaway, and so a completely separation. And so there's lots of people that do this. Luther and Calvin are a couple, but for us, what is important is the English Reformation. So when those Reformation forces that are already happening in Europe at the time get to England and finally create what is known as the Church of England. And that's an interesting story, which we probably all know, but we have King Henry VIII, who's a staunch Catholic, is known as the defender of the faith because he is so Catholic. He so supports the Pope. But then this rift develops with the Pope when he's not allowed to divorce his first wife, who is not able to give him a male heir. So this is the story that we always tell about this, and it's an important one. And so eventually he declares himself the head of a new church, and that's where we get the Church of England. His 6 wives have different fates. If anyone remembers the rhyme, someone can say it now. I can never split it off. That's all right. Oh, Vince can do it.
Divorced,
Beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. That's it. Sorry. As soon as you started saying it, I remembered it.
yeah.
Right.
And please, divorced, right? Catherine Howard.
All that to say, that's right. So that's going to come back in a minute because his children have a major role to play. But I think the really important piece of context that we need to put in here is, we have that story, and that is true. All of it is true. But to the point in which the Reformation forces are already happening, so that's not necessarily how the English church comes to be, it's more of that, like, Reformation is already taking place. This is 30 years into the Reformation at this point. So these forces are already happening. And so there is a notion that the Reformists take advantage of the situation. So who has the ear of the king to be able to push through a lot of these things? So this rift with the Pope becomes the way that the schism starts to take place. And through the Reformation forces that are already taking place in Europe, the Church of England is born. And through the Church of England, that's where we get the Book of Common Prayer. So that's one of the major reformations that takes place within the church, is the Book of Common Prayer, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it doesn't stop there, as it usually doesn't. So we have a tumultuous decade of fighting to create a distinct identity for Anglicanism. And so if you remember, King Henry VIII dies and puts Edward on the throne, who is a Protestant, as one of his, is the only male heir that he has, but Edward dies relatively quickly. And so there's a debate about who is going to be the monarch, and Edward tries to give it to Lady Jane Grey, but Queen Mary takes reign, and so she's known as Bloody Mary because she is staunchly Catholic herself, and is married to the King of Spain. And so it's the pendulum swing again. So we have this huge swing back to Catholicism, and lots of people die in the fray. And then when Mary dies, we swing back to Elizabeth, and again, lots of people die, but Elizabeth is again a staunch Protestant. And so this decade of back and forth between Protestantism and Catholicism, back to Protestantism. But the genius of Elizabeth is what's known as the Elizabethan Compromise, in which we get this distinct Anglicanism, which is what we like to call the Via Media, which is down there, but it's Catholic and Protestant. And the Great Compromise, the Elizabethan Compromise, does two things. And so the Act of Supremacy makes Elizabeth and the monarch of England the head of the Church of England. So makes her the head, so above the Archbishop of Canterbury, above the Archbishop of York, she is the head of the church, similar to how the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. But it also does something else called the Act of Conformity, which basically says, I don't care what you are, you have to go to church. And so she forces basically everyone in England to go together and to be in church. And there were penalties if you did not go to church. Frank?
Very quickly, in your timeline, where are the Crusades in the church history timeline?
That's a great question. I'm not a great historian on that, but
11th and 13th century.
Yeah, it's before this. Yeah, it's before this.
So it would be before the Protestant Reformation, but after the divide between
The schism, yes.
Western churches.
I can't remember when the first crusade is. It could possibly be before 1095. There we go. See? What was the date on the other page? Well, let's go back. 1054. All right, so roughly the same time. All right, so the Act of Conformity forces this kind of idea that the church has to be together. So people are penalized if they don't actually go and are part of the Church of England. So worshiping at the Church of England sites, using Church of England clergy, using the Book of Common Prayer, which is, this is a big thing, but that essentially creates what is a distinct Anglican identity even to this day, and that is that we have this distinct Catholic identity and Protestant identity. So it's this middle way of coming together, and we heard Dean Willis talk a little bit about that as well. So again, we're still sticking with our 100,000 foot view here, but what's important to know then, after we have a distinct Anglican tradition, we have a distinct identity as the Church of England, is that how does the church then start to spread? So that's our next question that we want to kind of delve into. So colonialism is a big topic that we're going to have to talk about in the church. I'm not talking about some of the negative implications of colonialism today, but note that I want to. But we just simply don't have time, and maybe that's a whole conversation that we need to talk about later, and I think it is. But this idea that where the English go, the church goes with them is important to understand. So when you have these massive colonialist efforts, the Church of England is a part of that colonialist effort, is a tool of that colonialist effort. And so originally these churches were not separate at all from the Church of England. And often, and not even often, always, the Bishop of London oversaw all of the clergy that were not physically located in England. So they did not have a separate bishop. They did not have a bishop that was in context with them. And so that's going to be a very important thing to hold on to. And we'll come back to that last bullet in a second. But so as colonialism is taking place here in the United States, the Church of England is a major part of that. And so lots of parishes are settled as Church of England parishes, as Anglican parishes, that then, through the Revolutionary War, have a crisis of identity. This is one of those parishes. You know, we are started in 1637. The Elizabeth River Parish is started in 1637. So this is getting into our own timeline now, our own history. But the Revolutionary War creates a very specific question for churches like Christ and St. Luke's, like Christ Church as it would have been, or the Elizabeth River Parish as it would have been at that time. But who are you going to be loyal to? So are you going to be loyal to the king, to the monarch? Are you going to be loyal to the revolution? One might also ask, should you be loyal to God? That would also be a good one to throw in there. So the real question of legitimacy for the American church starts to pop up, because if you are loyal to the revolution and you are moving away from the Church of England and from England itself, how does that apostolic succession still continue? So that's a real question. And even how does the church continue? And so in 1782, we have William White's The Case for the Episcopal Church in the United States considered. And so what William White does is, this is very close to the end of the war. We're about a year out from the official end of the Revolutionary War, and he sees the writing on the wall and says, basically, we don't have bishops here. We don't know how we're going to be able to continue. So he writes a case that basically says, let's be Presbyterian in structure. So he comes up with something that gives lots of power to the priests and to synods and to the laity in church governance and structure. And so this case is made. Now, simultaneously, we have different forces. Samuel Seabury is the leader of this force that are still advocating for this very episcopal structure that we have. So again, keeping to the structure of bishops as the authority figures and how we share authority in our church. So Samuel Seabury, after the Revolutionary War ends, is elected as the Bishop of Connecticut. So he's the first elected bishop in the United States. But we have a problem. To make a bishop, you need 2 other bishops. You need 3 other bishops. And so that's a problem because, again, there are none in the colonies. There are none now in the United States. And so the question then becomes, how are we going to do this? So Samuel Seabury goes over to England and tries to be consecrated as bishop through the Church of England. And essentially they say no, not necessarily because they don't want him to be bishop, but because, again, going back to the Elizabethan Compromise, the Act of Supremacy says that you have to swear allegiance to the monarch to be able to be a presbyter or a bishop in this structure. And so you can see that after the American Revolution, Samuel Seabury might not want to do that. And so you get this really interesting scenario where we have an elected bishop, we have someone that wants to be a bishop, we have no way to make them a bishop. And it's not because of theology, it's really because of legal laws that stop him from being able to become a bishop. So Samuel goes over to Scotland, which is another little foray into Anglican history, which I wish we had a lot of time for. But essentially, he goes to Scotland where there has already been another schism, and the non-juring bishops in Scotland, who in the 1600s, non-juring meaning non-swearing, basically said, we're not connected to the monarch anymore. We have our own connection to the apostolic succession. We already have bishops over here. We don't need the monarch in the same way. So they are not swearing to the monarch, but they also have the apostolic succession that ties them back to the early days of the church. So Samuel Seabury is consecrated as a bishop by the bishops in Scotland, who have a distinct Anglican identity, share the same Anglican heritage, although they don't have any sort of the same legalist problems that we have with ordaining Samuel Seabury. And they do it on one condition, and that's that that Samuel Seabury needs to take the Scottish Book of Common Prayer and use that as the basis for the American Book of Common Prayer, which is essentially what happens. We have a very unique Book of Common Prayer because we have a lot of traditions coming from the Scottish Episcopal Church. So we have one bishop, all right? We got one, good. So we need two others. The convention, a convention gathers in 1786 to start working on the canons and constitution and also a prayer book for the American church. And in that same year, British Parliament finally grants a request that the oath of allegiance does not need to be a part of it for the American bishops. So then you have William White, who's the same William White from up here with the Presbyterian structure that he kind of comes up with. William White is elected bishop in Pennsylvania, and Samuel Provost is elected bishop of New York, and they go over to England and are consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So now we have three bishops in the former colonies, and so our own connection to the apostolic succession, which is valid and can tie us back through our Anglican history, through our shared history, all the way back to the apostles themselves, we can continue to use that here without any of the influence of the English church. And that's important because now, we're going to skip over this for now, but so we have two distinct systems. Do we have one church, though? And that's the real question that happens after the American church forms, is that you have the Church of England operating relatively autonomously. You have the Episcopal Church that is relatively autonomous as well, though they have this shared structure. And so this leads us to a major question of communion, about how do we have relationships even though we don't have really any shared authority between the two churches anymore. And that's a big question of what we're trying to get to as we move to the Anglican communion. But there's a little more history before we get to that. So we talked about the Scottish Episcopal Church, and we talked about the non-juring bishops. And so then you have Samuel Seabury, and we already talked about all this, so we're going to skip it. The roots of the communion then still continue through this idea of colonialism. So we have bishops that start to pop up in different areas. So as we have American bishops, we start to see that it's helpful to have bishops in context, bishops working with the presbyters and and by that I mean priests, working with the priests, working with the congregations in their context to do ministry. That is very helpful because the bishop gets to have better oversight of that. If you were a bishop in London, you might never see Virginia. You might never see what it's like to be in context with a place. And so your worldview might change by the way that you interact with the local populace. And that's a really interesting question. So we start to see different bishops pop up. So this is just in rapid succession. You have bishops popping up in Nova Scotia, Quebec, Calcutta, Barbados, Jamaica, Madras, Australia, Bombay, Newfoundland, and Toronto. And so you see, these are all Church of England bishops that pop up, but you also have bishops that start to pop up in the 13 colonies as well. So those three American bishops don't stay three American bishops for long. They start making other bishops, as they are allowed to do. We have the Diocese of Tennessee that pops up 1834 outside of the original 13 colonies that we have, which would have eventually all gotten their own bishops as well. But you start to see how the church is expanding. And again, I'm talking about this in a very generalized sense. There's lots of complications with this as well that we need to talk about. But this idea of expansionism is a driving force between how we need to be in relationship with the rest of the world, specifically the other parts of the Anglican world. And so let's see where we got here. Yeah. So then, a lot of this is more history than we probably need today, and I want to leave some time for questions. But you'll start to see then that these missionary expansions create difficulties. And so there's lots of instances where there's a problem in a specific area of the church that needs greater oversight than what they can actually give. And so there's a desire to have a structure in which not necessarily giving authority to a specific person, but how do we talk about these larger issues that are happening? And so a big one of those happens in South Africa. And so you'll see coming out of this General Synod here, the church, this is a quote, says, "The church would be most effectually preserved and perpetuated if means could be adopted by which the members of our Anglican communion in all quarters of the world should have a share in the deliberations for her welfare, and to be permitted to have a representation in one general council of her members gathered from every land." So that's actually the first time the word Anglican communion is used, coming from this controversy in South Africa, which we don't need to get into, mainly because the guy that was being brought up on charges of heresy, he doesn't really believe lots of things that are different than what we believe today. But we don't need to get into that. That's fine. And so that's a really big piece of why the church starts to have these conversations. And so then we get what's called the Lambeth Conference, which we heard a little bit about last week with Dean Willis as well. But the Lambeth Conference meets every 10 years, and it is a pulling together of every single bishop that is in the Anglican communion. So if you are part of this shared structure, part of this shared identity as Anglicanisms, you get called to Lambeth for a conference where you get to do similar, what they're saying here. There's no authority that is given to the Lambeth Conference, except that people are working in relationships and seeing how they can be better in their ministry through the lessons that we share as a whole. So that's what starts happening at the Lambeth Conference, and that leads to this idea of the instruments of communion, of which the Lambeth Conference is one. I don't know if I go into that here. We're going to skip that one for now. Here are the instruments of communion. And this is where we're going to spend a lot of our time next week, is talking about these instruments of communion. So the Archbishop of Canterbury is an instrument. So it's a way of maintaining relationship. So a relationship with the Archbishop of Canterbury is one way in which we stay in communion. The Lambeth Conference is another one of those ways in which we foster and develop relationship. And then the primates meeting, basically all of the archbishops of those 46 provinces get together for a meeting outside of Lambeth. So Lambeth is every bishop, which is how many, Jenny? Thousands of bishops. So, it's a really incredible thing to see. The primates meeting is really just the 46 primates that are over all of those provinces. And then the consultative council it's the only instrument of communion that has representatives from the fourfold order of ministry. So you have lay people that are represented there. You have deacons and priests that can be elected to that as well. And we're going to talk about those a little more in depth next week. So don't worry about this as it stands right now. I think the thing to take away, though, is that we have this shared history, this shared governing structure, but not governance. Notice the difference between those two. We have a shared worship, liturgy, and prayer life through the Book of Common Prayer. But we also have relationship, which keeps us all together. So that's where I'm going to put a pin in it for today and leave a little time for questions. Yes. Yeah, I will repeat the question if someone asks. I certainly didn't explain it all well enough that no one has any questions. So,
I can understand Canada, and I expect it's still quite active today. Same Australia. But I think I saw China and maybe India. I'm just wondering, today's,
you're referring to this map? Yeah, so we have provinces that are doing work in all of these areas. So Japan is a big one over there. You'll see the church in Korea over there. Is there an official presence in China?
Yes,
Okay.
Hong Kong.
Hong Kong would be the
And
presence there.
The Episcopal Church, Taiwan is a diocese of the Episcopal Church. But there is an Anglican church in Hong Kong. But China is a little messy. And there's the Church of South India and the Church of North India.
okay.
And they do have full Anglican churches. They may be extra provincial. But yes, they have Anglican presence.
Ginny is the Global Relations and Networking Officer for the Episcopal Church, so that's why I said she's a plant. She knows far more than I do. She's also my wife, so that's good. But I like to lead with the important things first, right? Yes?
Virgin, aren't most of the, worldwide churches Anglican versus Episcopal?
So that kind of comes back to the question of right after the divide. So the American Revolution, there's this, it's the same sort of sentiment that I don't want to swear allegiance to the king, because that's a big question for a time, is whether the church in America continues on as just another branch of the church in England. And so when you have that break and that divide, there's this idea that we need to rename ourselves as well. So the Episcopal Church becomes a name to define what we are in America versus Church of England. So this Anglican identity, I don't even know if it would have been called the Anglican Church in England either, but it would have been the Church of England. So these terms come up later, but the Episcopal name refers to our structure. And it's really just a way of differentiating ourselves from Church of England in terms of the allegiance to the monarch. But it's talking about the structure which we still share with the Church of England.
But isn't it limited to the U.S.?
It is not. There are many provinces that have an Episcopal name they're a part of the Anglican Communion, but have that shared structure. So where you call yourself that, I mean, that's history of the diocese, history of the province.
And the Episcopal Church is beyond the U.S. as well. Like our province exists in, I think it's 15 now, countries and territories. So even within the Episcopal Church, we are not just the Episcopal Church of the United States. We are.
Right, and so that leads to not necessarily the missionary efforts in the early 1800s, but as we are a church now, we have expanded past our own borders. And so that's good to reminder. We are not a national church. We don't ever refer to it as the National Episcopal Church because we are not national. We are its own entity operating in many different countries. So we've got probably time for one more question. Yeah.
And like other British, like Australia, right? Is that like the national church in Australia?
It depends on the province. I'm not a great historian on each province. So I think what's interesting about Church of England is it is almost a national identity about, the way that their church is structured is, parishes are physical bounds. They are physical areas. And we heard Dean Willis talk about this in terms of if you're the parish priest, everyone within the bounds of your parish are your responsibility. So whether or not they are Anglican, whether or not they are Christian, they are still under your cure. So someone that you are supposed to be involved in a relationship with. So it's a little different than how we conceptualize things. We talk about people as being a member of our parish if they attend our church. which is just a little different way to conceptualize it. So I don't know exactly how Australia is structured. I would guess with the history of the colonialism there and with some of the interplays with how we deal with indigenous populations, that it's not the same sort of feel as you might have in Church of England. I don't know if that answers your question, but go ahead and put in.
Is Scotland, is there a Church of Scotland separate from the Church of England?
Yes, so the Episcopal Church of Scotland is its
Yeah.
own province.
It's its own province.
But we have another map that would show like all the provinces and all the countries. So the province of Southern Africa is 5 countries.
Right.
The province of Central America is all the countries in Central America. So there are some churches. The Church of Mexico is just the Church of Mexico. But so it differs across the world.
You guys are asking the right questions, and we're going to delve into more of these structure questions next week as well. Yes?
I just wondered, this is a very nice PowerPoint. Would you make that available when you make the
We can find a way to make it available. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So next week, we're going to lead off with talking about some of those instruments communion and how that helps everyone within the structure of the communion maintain relationships. So, and we'll do a bit of dreaming on that. And then in the last week, we'll talk about where the Anglican communion is now and where we might be going. So what are some of the questions that both help and hinder us from staying in relationship? So we're in a very interesting spot as Anglicans right now, and so how we all weather that together will lead to some interesting fruits of the Spirit. So thanks, everybody. Hope to see you next week.